literary event of this afternoon. We have the great pleasure of having with us here Gabriella Ybarra, the author of the book The Dinner Guest, or El Comensal in the original Spanish version. First of all, thank you very much, Gabriella, for being with us here today.
And thank you for inviting me.
And I've understood that this is not the last and only chance to listen to you this week, so there will be another event tomorrow, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, tomorrow at 1 here at the university. I don't know the name of the exact place.
I think it's here as well in this
Finnish names. I'm sorry.
Tiedekulma, okay, in Tiedekulma. Right. This book that we're going to discuss today has been, well, it was first published in Spain in 2015, and it was nominated for the Booker International Book Prize in 2018, right after it was translated into English. And I'm afraid the book has been a little bit difficult to read here in Helsinki because we don't have a translation in Finnish yet. And I luckily got one of the 2 copies that were available at the library, so I could read it before the interview. So I would like to ask you first to contextualize a little bit the events that your book tells about. So it opens with a scene where your grandfather, armed terrorists enter the house of your grandfather, handcuff his children, among of which is your father, and take him away to a secret location, and then they ask for a huge sum of money as ransom, and eventually proceed to torture and kill him. So could you please contextualize for the audience a little bit, what is the political and historical background to these events? Why is this happening, and who was your grandfather?
My grandfather was the mayor of a town in the north of Spain that is called Bilbao, and he was a mayor there during the Franco years, and he was kind of a symbol of many things that the ETA terrorists wanted to fight against. No, one was like the political power of the Franco time, and it was also the money. What they call that's what they call the oligarchy, like the Basque oligarchy. He was one of the members, so he was a symbol. He represented all that. No, so by kidnapping my grandfather, they would capture at the same time many symbols. It wasn't because of him, like there was nothing personal against him as a person. It was just like all the symbols that he encapsulated. But when I was a kid, I was raised in the same neighborhood as where my grandfather lived, in the suburbs of Bilbao, and I always lived as if this story had nothing to do with me. I knew that my grandfather was murdered, but it was something that seemed like very far from my life, no, some kind of fiction. So it was a story that I had always heard, but for me it was hard to assimilate it as a real story. So my dad would tell me many stories, and this was just another one. And he had been murdered only 6 years before I was born, so it wasn't that far in time. But for me, it seemed like a very, very, very far in time story, like a very, very old story that had nothing to do with my life. And then the book, the second part, what happens is that my mother is sick, and she eventually dies from cancer. And when my mother dies, then I have like this first experience with death, and I see my dad acting very strange, and I don't really understand why. And then he starts telling me that I have already lived through this. I have a lot of experience with death. And it was like, experience with death? Like, how come? Like, this is very, very strange, no? And then the death of my mother made visible like all these other deaths that were surrounding me. And I had lived as if like I wasn't able to see them, no? Like the death of my father, and my dad had to have a bodyguard for 14 years, which is also a very big presence of of death, no? Like this guy is there because in case someone wants to murder him, he has to go first. So I had been surrounded by death, but wasn't able to see it. So this is like the story of how I try to pull the murder of my grandfather out of the fiction, and acknowledge that what happened was true. But it's curious because to do that, I have to make up a story because nobody tells me the story of how my grandfather dies. Every time that I ask at home, they change themes. They want to talk about something else, like this is stuff that we don't talk about. And so I only have like some data, and I have to fill the holes with fiction, no? With things that I make up.
Yes, and I think this whole topic of storytelling and fiction and fact is a key to understand your book and the way you write about these things. You mentioned that this was a story that was told to you. There is also this story that you talk about in the very beginning of the book about the figure of the dinner guest, El Comensal. So could you maybe tell a little bit of the story of El Comensal? Who was the dinner guest? What kind of figure is that?
Well, the dinner guest for me is a metaphor of death. It's like an absence and a presence at the same time, because one of the places where I realized more that my mother wasn't there anymore is when the whole family sat together at the table. I think in most families we'll have like fixed places at the table, or we always sit in the same place. No? So when my mother wasn't there, there was this empty space, no? And my sister Inés had to move one seat, and we all knew that was not her place, no? So for me, that image of that empty space at the table was a very big representation of death. And then I learned, because I didn't know, presenting the book, that in some cultures, like the Jewish culture, they leave an empty plate at the table for those who are not there. And I didn't know that when I used this image, but they do it in some celebrations, and I think it's a very nice thing.
Yeah, absolutely, to remember those who are missing. There has been a lot of discussion in the recent years about the topic of historical memory and writing about recent history, and how our memories are mixed with stories that we have been told, and actually how much of our memories are actually our own, and how to what extent they have been created by something that we have been told. How has this been reflected in Spanish literature recently? So is there a trend of writing about historical events recently, or would you say that your book forms a part of this?
Well, I think you always write about what you know, no? So yeah, there are many books in Spain that talk about political events, like the Civil War, or now there is like a small boom, no, with books about the ETA terrorist movement. No, there was this Patria very big event, and like there was this book, no, that sold millions of copies, that was about ETA, and there are some other authors that have traditionally also written about it, also in Basque, but maybe the public wasn't ready until very recent years to listen to these stories, no? And I think my book was the first book that had a big, that had a lot of press. It was published in 2015, and then Patty had a lot more press than me. And one of the things that people got mad when they read my book was that, but you don't tell everything. And it's like, well, no, I'm telling my story. I don't want to tell everything. That's not what I wanted when I sat to write this book. And I think one of the very big successes of Patria is that what Aramburu does to try to to cover a very broad spectrum of the story. That's what made it. I think it's what made it so successful, because many people got mad with me and said, "But I want you to tell everything." Yeah, I think. Imagine there are themes that they never wear out. No, there's so much to say about terrorism. There's the trauma, there's violence. There are many angles, no, that you can approach the stories, like writing about a war. It's infinite. How many books have we read about the Second World War? I don't know, or movies. It never ends, and they keep coming new stories. So I think with this case, it's the same. Regarding historical memory, I'm a very big defender of the personal stories, because I think it's very hard to tell a story, or at least try to be as personalized as possible, because otherwise it turns into ideology very easily. So I'm a very big defender of personal stories. And I think it's very good that many stories come up, because it helps the people to process the trauma, no, that they have lived through. And it's good that that the stories are very different, that they don't all tell the same story, no, that they have many angles. So it's richer, the spectrum, and everyone can feel represented as well.
That was actually going to be my next question about the reception of the book in Spain. So you told already that many readers were mad because you didn't tell everything, you didn't cover everything, all parts of the story, but I assume that you also got positive feedback from the readers. Or how was the reception in general in Spain, apart from that critique that you received?
In general, the reception was good. The people liked the story. Not everyone, but most of the people, at least in the press, all the reviews I got were good. And also it amazed me that it was able to connect with, because I didn't know, like, I wrote this book without knowing that it was going to be published. I started to write it because I kind of needed it. And when it went out to the world, I didn't, for me it was like a taboo, all the themes that I talked about, because in my family, talking about the murder of my grandfather was the worst thing that you could ever do, no? So for me, it had also a very profound repercussion in how my family read the book, no? Like for me, it was that more important than what the people that I don't know thought about it, no? So for my father, for example, it was very shocking to read it. And for the rest of my family too. Although I think it was positive, because it ended up opening like new communication channels between us, no? We were able to talk more about the death of my grandfather and how my father lived it, because he had never told me, like, the only thing that he will tell me is that he had not suffered. Like, I did not suffer, why do you write about this? Yeah, so it was like, I think some people, like, there are two things that can happen to you when you live such a big trauma, is that you can either victimize yourself and all your life goes around it, or you can avoid the problem, like erase it and live as if it never happened. No, so in my family there were more of the second strategy, and I think none of them is good. So you probably have to acknowledge what happens and then put it in some place. I don't know, it's hard to find the place, but try to put it somewhere and then move on, no? But not ignoring the past. And yeah, the reception, sometimes it's hard because it's a theme that people have very strong opinions and they want you to, they ask you a lot of political questions that, well, they ask me lots of political questions that are not of, I haven't really thought them, no? I am just telling my life.
Yeah, exactly. Would you say that this culture of not talking about traumatic events is something typical just for your family, or is it how is the culture in Spain in general, in the society? Has there been, or is there starting to be a discussion about ETA terrorism, for example, or is it too soon perhaps to talk about these things openly?
They talk about it, but it's very, I don't know how to say it. It's very polarized.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think that there is a very serene and productive debate. No, sometimes I think most of the time it's used to attack one another. That's the feeling that I have. And we are very bad with historical memory in Spain too. Like, with the Civil War, it was very, it wasn't discussed that much either. I mean, Franco was like 2 years ago gotten out of his tomb, just 2 years ago, no? And changed, because he was in the Valle de los Caídos, and they just changed his tomb like 2 years ago. So, and there were many streets in Madrid that had the names of generals until very, very recent years.
Yeah, and of course the Civil War was a much longer time ago, and talking about ETA terrorism might be, well, it ended officially in 2011, right? So it's quite recent still. You mentioned in the last part of your book, so the first part, like you told, is about the death of your grandfather, the murder of your grandfather. Then you tell this about the death of your mother, and in the end you return to the topic of ETA and terrorism again a little bit, and you mentioned that there is this. You mentioned briefly the torture of the political prisoners, for example, and you say that, well, some say that it never happened, some say that it always happened, and neither of that is true. So is this an ongoing discussion in the Spanish society, or?
There is a lot of taboo. Well, for me it's very hard. Like I'm not an expert in the. In the book, there is while I was writing the story of my grandfather, I tried to make like a small exercise of what do the people of the other side of the spectrum, who for me have always been like not monsters, but for me were like, I say it in the book, like they were for like Martians. Like for me, the terrorists were like science fiction, no? Like a Martian, more or less. So the people who would support them, they were just not in my world. For me, they were completely, they were super foreign. So I tried to understand what they asked for, and what do they fight for, and so I found all these articles about tortures, and for me it was very hard to make an opinion. No, there are very few. I don't remember right now, but there are very few recognized tortures. But at the same time, there are many. No sé cómo se dice. Demandas, no?
Demands.
Yeah, demands. And so, yeah, I put the case of one that was true, and there's always also this conflict, not to recognize the tortures as a bad thing and terrorism as a bad thing too. Like if I like a country that is democratic and where the policemen don't abuse their power, no, and if they do so, that they pay for that, and I think that's what we all want.
Do you think it's possible to forgive the terrorists, what they did to your grandfather, for example, or what they did to your family?
Well, I don't think much about that. I don't want my well-being to be in the power of somebody that I don't know.
Yeah.
So I don't think much about that, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like I'm serene myself, so I don't want to be expecting, oh, will he be there to say me if he's sorry? I don't want to be thinking about that.
Right.
But I'm not. I don't have an anger. As I tell you, for me, it's not because I feel that I'm like a good person. It's just that I think that for me, I have always lived it as if it was something, some fictions like ghosts. No, for me it's hard to be angry with a ghost or something. I would get angry with my father because he was the one that was at home and that was the one that had the bodyguard and was the one that made our life more complicated, which is very unfair, but it happens, no? So if you want to do something and you can't because your father can't go there, like if you want to go for a trip, for example, no? In a town in the Basque Country and your dad can't go, you would get mad because your dad couldn't go. You wouldn't get mad with the terrorists. You would get mad with your father, with my father.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Let's now move on to discuss your writing style a little bit. I think I read in a review about your book that you write without adjectives, and as a linguist I thought, well, that's interesting. How can one write without adjectives? And it's not literally true. Of course there are adjectives in the book, but in our discussion before this event you mentioned that you try to write in an objective way. Right, so you try to avoid some adjectives, like saying, referring to this terrible murder or something like that. So is this a conscious choice in your writing? Is this just the way you write, or is it something that you chose for this particular topic?
Yeah, I think I thought a lot about how I wrote the story because there are so many words that have a very strong political connotations. So, for example, how do you name the territory? Wow, that was crazy. Horrible. How do you name, if you don't want to sound like the news, you know? Like what I didn't want is the book to sound, when you read the book, I wanted you to forget about the news. Like to get far from your political position and just enter the story as a member of the family, no? Which it's really impossible because you always have a point of view, but I wanted to erase all those conflicting words, and sometimes it was like playing taboo, and I wanted it to sound natural as well. No, I didn't want it to sound, and how do you name their territory? How you name the terrorist? Because now I use the word terrorist, but that word also has a political position when you use that word. No? How do you name? Like in the book, I don't think the word terrorist appear, but you don't. But now I use it, and there are many words that I didn't want to use, and then also I wanted to be as neutral as possible, and to be able to develop my own language, my own words to talk about these events. No, I didn't want to use the words of anybody else. Not and that was an exercise that I put a lot of effort into it.
Yeah, I think that's really visible in your writing. Well, I had to read the book in translation into English, unfortunately, but what I found interesting is this mismatch of telling a really personal story, or, well, something that has really has to do with yourself, and at some points reading the book is, you get this feeling of reading maybe a report or something very objective, so it seems that you kind of try to write also in a way devoid of feelings or sentiments. Is that correct?
Well, I think the feelings are there. Maybe they are not so explicit, but they're controlled, no? But they are. I did want to put some feelings in it. I cried a lot while writing the book, but when I wrote the book, all the emotional part, when I was correcting, I removed it because I thought that the book was more. That the book worked better when I removed the emotional part, and it was also able to, how do you say, conmover, you know? You know when you watch a movie and there is, sometimes they touch you more when you see somebody that has like one tear here that it's about to burst, that when it's crying and crying and crying, no? Most of the times you get more touched just with a little tear, no? So that was the feeling that I wanted to replicate. I didn't want the reader to see myself like crying. I wanted to be more controlled.
Yeah, so that also leaves space for the reader's own emotions to feel in.
Yeah, of course. I want the reader to complete. I want the reader to take his own position in the story. I want the reader to project his own feelings. And when you write autobiography, something that it's very interesting is that a lot of people tell you secrets after that. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of people project their own personal stories in your story, no? So every time that I go to a presentation or so, sometimes someone comes up to me and tells me the most amazing stories, actually. Stories about dead mothers, fathers, brothers, grandfathers. A person that told me how she kept the ashes of her husband in the drawer of the sweaters. Mm. I thought that was very nice. Like every time that when she dressed in the morning, she would see there her husband, or even stories about violence. Many stories about violence. I'm impressed of how much violence there is in the world, because sometimes you think that your story is so special, no? That the terrorism in Spain is something so unique, and there is terrorism in so many countries. In Ireland, when I went to India, they were talking to me about Kashmir. People from Argentina that have told me about the repression in Argentina. So many people tell me stories about violence, even from the civil war. And what's beautiful is that when they tell me as I tell the story from a very personal point of view, people from many ideological positions feel close to the story, which I think it's beautiful too.
Yeah. Tell us about. Well, you mentioned that you've been to India, you've been to many places to talk about the book. So tell us a little bit about the promotion of the book. How was it? And how was it? Did you get different reactions in different places? I would assume that the reception of the book was different for instance, in Spain compared to other countries.
Well, in Spain it was harder to talk about the book. Yeah. Because many people wanted me to make like very strong political affirmations and sometimes use me to send like weird messages that I didn't want to give, and for me, I think that this book, well, I can see it now with more perspective because 6 years have passed, or 7, I don't know, 6 years since it got published, and I think this is a process of me about learning how to talk about the trauma of my family. So I think this book, for example, is how I announce the trauma, like I name it. And then, so for me, it was very hard to keep on talking about the book. I kind of got frozen when I saw that there were like so many people with strong ideas, no? Talking about these themes, and as I tell you, I was just telling my story. So now I want to evolve this personal language about the trauma and about the terrorism, and because one of the problems that I had is when I started to talk about it, then I saw like many people with different ideas and positions, and I was very confused because I said, where do I put myself in this map, no? I don't feel close to these people, but I also don't feel close to these other people. So I realized that my position is to be alone and to develop my own path and my own language to talk about the trauma. And now, for example, I'm very interested in, and I'm investigating in all the supernatural dimension of the trauma, no? of the violence, because the terrorism is most of the time it's not happening. It's just there, like floating around. So all of this idea of the ghost in the trauma is something that interests me a lot. So the language now that I'm exploring is more kind of a magic language.
Okay, that sounds interesting. So you mentioned that you're working on your next book. So could you tell a little bit about that already?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you a little bit. I'm exploring how I started to write about how we had to move from the Basque Country to Madrid, like from one day to another, no, because it got very tense. We got lots of menaces, and so. I wanted to analyze the neighborhood. That for me gives an opportunity to analyze the neighborhood where I lived in the Basque Country, which is a very specific neighborhood that had its own rules and was kind of a little ghetto. And then to try to also analyze how the freedom of movement impacts the freedom of speech and the impossibility, that because I have many problems to tell my own story, and so it for me is super hard. So I think there is something in this constraint of movement that has that is something that I have to fight against to have more freedom of speech, like my own freedom. I censor myself a lot. Because I've been taught to censor myself.
You also mentioned that it wasn't until the death of your mother that your family started to openly discuss about this murder of your grandfather, and all these events. Do you think you would have written this book or another book about the topic if it wasn't for the personal experience?
Well, I don't know. I think it would have come out in another way. Now I see that every time, because I didn't want to write, for example, about terrorism when I wrote. I started to write about my mother and about her death, and I didn't want to write about terrorism. Like, I said, really about this? No, I don't want to. And now, when I finished this book, I didn't want to. I started to write, and I didn't want to write about terrorism another time. I wanted to change topics, and I started 2 books. And then, when I got, 30 pages, when I'm 30 pages into something, then suddenly a terrorist pops up there. So I think any time that I would have had any approach to literature, it would have come up. So it came up with my mother, but it's coming up with other themes that I explore. Because I think there's just too much to explore about it. Because there was such a big taboo, and I've suddenly made visible, like my mother, what made is the trauma visible, but maybe other situations would have made it, no? Because it's very hard to keep it down all the time.
Yeah. There are also 2 other deaths, I think, in the book. One of them is the death of the Swiss novelist Robert Walser, who died in 1956, and you also include an image of the novelist. This quite iconic image where he's lying on the snow, dead with his footprints on the snow. So what is the importance of Walser to your writing or to you personally? Why did you include this reference in the book?
Well, I included this reference because I love Robert Walser as a writer, and I like how he writes without giving himself too much importance, and I think he's a huge writer that writes from about tiny things, no? And what I liked is he was a very he got mad, no? In his last years, he was at mental hospital, in Herisau, in Switzerland, and he was in very bad condition, but he kept walking on the snow in the woods every day, and he died doing what he loved the most, that was to walk in the woods. And that made me think about how even if you are in the worst conditions, sometimes you can still have like that freedom of what you do in your last will, no? Like the freedom to die the way you want or you like, even if you are in a mental hospital. And I also thought about this situation was very inspiring for me when I thought about the death of my mother and the death of my grandfather, because they were also captive in different ways. My mother was captive at a hospital with a very bad with very bad expectations about her illness, no? That she knew that she was going to die in days, but she died in peace because she was surrounded by all the people she loved, and how knowing that she was going to die, it freed her, no? Which I found amazing. And my grandfather, who was also in the worst possible conditions, he was kidnapped in a very small place and without eating, but he was very religious, so he made sense of his captivity by offering his pain to God, and we know that because he wrote some letters, and I think it's amazing how they cannot steal that from you, no? That possibility to kind of, I don't know if die in peace, because I wasn't there, but kind of make sense of your death, like give it a meaning.
Yeah, and your existence. You had a purpose.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So I think the three have that in common, not that they died doing what they liked the most. That my grandfather had a lot of pleasure found a lot of pleasure also in religion. And my mother, by what she liked the most was to be surrounded by her friends and her family, and all her friends were at the hospital when she died. It was crazy, no? And Walser loved walking in the snow, no? So that's why I liked that.
Interesting. That really helps to understand that kind of parallelism that exists between these three.
And also
deaths.
one thing, sorry that I interrupted you, that Walser described how he wanted to die. In his book, The Walk, he said, oh, how lovely, I'm just making up the words, I'm sorry, but something like, oh, how lovely it would be to die in the middle of the woods. Oh, no, something like that, he says. And he dies in the middle of the woods. And that possibility to design your death, no? And also that many people die doing what they usually do. Yeah, I had the editor of my book, for example, which is very sad, but he died working, he died editing books. And many people that I know die doing the things that they do. Yeah, it's amazing. And while I was writing this book, also a friend of mine died in Africa, and he loved to travel, and he died traveling, no? I had never thought about it before.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
What are your main literary influences? Would you say that, well, we mentioned Balsa already, but were you inspired by other books or by other writers when writing this book?
When I was writing this book, I had many problems, for example, to describe my mother, because I had a very good relationship with her. We got along very well, so for me it was, every time that I wrote about her, it was very boring, because it was, oh, we did all these things together and it was so nice, and literally it didn't work. So I had many problems to build this character. And for example, there was a poem that gave me a lot of ideas, that it's called One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, that is called The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. And this poem, I had it in my head all the time while I was writing this book. And I think it captures very well the spirit of the book. And for example, my mother was somebody that seemed to have been ready to lose all her life. She was so detached from all. So when she died, there was nothing to to remove. She had like a few clothes, no? And and she was so detached from the world that it was very easy for her to die. And that was one of the things that impressed me the most. It's as if she had been practicing all her life to die, and also it helped me through the process of grief. And then another book that helped me was The Year of Magical Thinking by John Didion, for example. I had it very present. I read it very early on while I was writing this book, and I thought that I had nothing to do with her, because there was this passage where she said that she was keeping the shoes of her husband just in case he came back. And I said, John Didion is crazy, like why would she do that? Like we all know that he's not coming back. But then suddenly, when a year after my mother died, I started to go to all the places where she had been in New York while she was sick, because she got treated in New York. So I went to all the hospitals, to all the places that we were together when she was at the city. And I said, oh, I'm doing the same thing as John Didion did. Like I'm coming to all these places in case I see my mother, I think. And so that made me also think. And I'm sure that there were many books, but those are the two that I can, the poem and that book.
This reminds me of something you also write in the book, that you are kind of repeating things that happened a year ago, like after the death of your mother and so on. So, yeah.
Like a ritual, no?
Like a ritual, exactly.
Well, the book entirely is about a ritual of grief of the death of my mother.
Yeah.
But the thing is that while I was trying to elaborate the grief of my mother, I stumbled upon another grief. That was the grief of my grandfather that wasn't resolved. So it's like a grief that has a detour with another unresolved grief, and then I go back to my mother.
Yes. I think it would be nice to take a couple of questions from the audience. So if you have any questions to Gabriella Ybarra about the book, the dinner guest, or about anything else. Yes.
Yeah, well, the first question, I think it is very important to write literature about the historical events, and they give an information that the history books don't give you, is that the emotions, although in this book the emotions are kind of controlled and they are not very explicit, they are there, and it's very also, and the novels also what help, and literature what helps is to connect at a personal level to the different points of view and players in the historical event, no? Which I think it's very interesting, and yeah, I think that it does help open many logs. It has helped me open many logs, at least, as writing and also reading, because yeah, you empathize, no? It's an exercise of empathy, both writing and reading, no? Because when you create a character, you have to empathize with that character, and when you read, you have to empathize with the characters, and it's also an exercise of imagination, no? In which there's not that much room for that in a history book. So I think it's very important to open locks, all that empathy dimension. And well, my immediate family, it's very big, it's very extended. My dad has 11 brothers and sisters. So some of them hated it, others like it, but people who liked me before, they still like me, so it's okay. But it's normal. I understand them, and I don't get mad if they get mad, because I have the control to say what I want, but they don't, no? So, and also for them, it's a way of reliving a very hard moment. Like I have an aunt that she has a very bad time, that every time that I'm on the newspaper, she hates it, and I completely understand it. Why does she have to talk about my father? I want to forget it, no, not to be there in the pain. So yeah, it's something that happens every time that you write, because you can, when you write about yourself, you always live, you have to talk about the people who live around you, no? And for them, it's hard. And I always think that my father and my sisters have been very generous to accept it. Yeah. It's risky.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? Is there something you would like to ask the audience?
No, it's okay. I'm sorry,
tell them.
because my English is a little bit rusty. I haven't spoken
Not
in
at
English
all.
for a very
Not at
long
all.
time.
Yeah.
And I forget words all the time.
Yeah. I hope we get a finished translation of the book soon. It would be really important, I think. It's a remarkable book. Maybe we could still go back to your writing style. I found it very interesting because there is this whole idea that, well, combining memories, stories, and history. Is it time to wrap up already? Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's make this a very brief question. Then I think it's interesting how you, in some passages, you start by telling that it isn't true that. It isn't true that, for example, in one of the chapters, or you say that my mother must have thought, it must have happened, and so on. So, would you like to comment a little bit on these strategies of emphasizing that these are stories?
Well, memory is always a fiction, no?
Yeah.
And even when the things that appeared in the news about my grandfather, for example, some of them, then in another article, they said, well, it was not true what they said there. The truth is blah, blah, blah. So even the newspapers weren't completely true. So I'm using a material that we don't know if it's completely true, and then memory, which is a construction, no? Yeah. So and I've also made up some things because I didn't know how to continue the story. So, like, if nobody tells me how this happened, well, I'll have to make it up.
Right.
Because I needed a story. I needed a story to continue. You know what I was telling you about the trauma before. You don't want to get tangled in the victimization, and you don't want to forget about it or ignore it. You have to have your story, and if nobody tells me the story, I'll make it up.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for making up these stories for us. Thanks for the interview, and thanks for the audience.
Thank you too.